Rain against tall windows. The library is empty except for one woman shelving books in the dim after-hours light. Margaret Holt, 61, cardigan, reading glasses on a chain. Quiet. Unremarkable. A black SUV pulls up outside. Two men in dark coats step out, moving with the unhurried precision of people who have done this before. They are not here to borrow books. Margaret doesn't look up right away. She finishes sliding a book into place first. Then her eyes move to the security mirror in the corner, a small, practiced glance, the kind of glance that scans exits, not titles. The men enter. One asks for the Holloway County Historical Archive, the sealed boxes. Margaret's hand rests, very lightly, on the edge of the returns cart. Under the cart, out of sight, her fingers find something bolted to its underside. She says, calmly, "That collection isn't open to the public." The taller man smiles the way people do when they've already decided the answer doesn't matter. Margaret closes the book in her hands. Softly, "You should have called first." Cut to black. The Holloway County Public Library opened at 8, though Margaret Holt was always there by 7. She liked the building before the town woke into it, the smell of old paper and radiator dust, the particular silence that only existed in the hour before the doors unlocked. She moved through the stacks with a small cart, returning books to their places by memory rather than by call number. She had not needed the number system in 11 years. Ask her for anything, a county land deed from 1938, a genealogy record, the correct spelling of a farmer's name 3 generations gone, and she would walk directly to it, without hesitation, without searching. The town found this charming. Margaret never forgets a thing, people said, the way they might say a woman never forgot to water her plants. It was affection, not scrutiny. No one in Holloway had ever asked why a small-town librarian's memory functioned like an index. At 8:15, Danny Wexler came in for the newspaper, same as every day. He was 78, widowed, slow on his feet since the knee surgery. Margaret had the local paper already folded and waiting on the counter before he reached it. "You always know," he said. "You always come at 1:15, she said. "That's not knowing. That's paying attention." He laughed, the way he always did, and shuffled to his usual chair by the window. Margaret watched him settle, not glancing, exactly, but noting, gait steady today, breathing even, no cane. A small, unconscious inventory. She did this with everyone who walked through her door. She had done it so long she no longer noticed she was doing it. At mid-morning, a delivery truck idled too long outside the building before finally pulling away. Margaret marked the time without deciding to. 10:42. Gone by 10:47. 5 minutes was long for a delivery with nothing to deliver. She said nothing about it. There was nothing yet to say. Her assistant, Ellie Marsh, 23, arrived at 11 for her afternoon shift, tote bag over one shoulder, headphones around her neck. She dropped her bag behind the desk and exhaled like the day had already tired her out. "You ever get bored here?" Ellie asked, not for the first time. Same shelves. Same 10 people. Every single day. Margaret considered the question honestly, the way she considered most things. "No," she said. "Boredom is a kind of inattention. I'm rarely inattentive." Ellie smiled like it was a joke. It wasn't. The afternoon passed in its usual rhythm, a return stack of large print mysteries, a schoolteacher requesting materials on the county's founding families, a toddler's book dropped and retrieved. Margaret handled each with the same unhurried precision, the same economy of motion. She never rushed. She never wasted a step. There was something in the stillness of her that most people mistook for age, when it was, in fact, control. Near closing, she walked the perimeter of the building, an old habit dressed as tidying. She checked the back door was latched. She noted the streetlight outside had not yet come on, though it was dark enough that it should have. She filed that fact away without alarm, the way she filed everything. Quietly, permanently, in a place she rarely needed to open. She locked the front doors at 6, turned off the light section by section, and stood for a moment in the near-dark building, listening. Nothing. Not yet. She told herself that, and she believed it, mostly. Then she went home to an empty house that had once held a husband, a government job neither of them discussed at dinner parties, and a locked box in the archive room that no one in Holloway had opened in 30 years. Tomorrow, Someone would ask about it. She did not yet know that. But some part of her, old, trained, and used for a long time, had already begun, quietly, to prepare. The man came in at 1:30, 10 minutes before the library's quiet hour ended. Margaret registered him before he reached the desk. The way he entered without hesitating at the door, the way his eyes moved once across the room and settled on the exits before settling on her. Most patrons looked at the shelves first. He looked at the room. "I'm researching the Holloway Courthouse fire," he said. 1974. "I understand your archive has the original incident records." "We have newspaper coverage," Margaret said. "The county keeps the incident reports at the state office in Raleigh. I was told the library holds duplicates." He smiled. Pleasant. Prepared. "Historical Society donation, I believe. Sealed collection." Margaret did not answer immediately. She was doing what she always did, cataloging, only now the catalog was him. His shoes were new but scuffed deliberately at the toe, the kind of wear someone added to look ordinary. His questions were too specific for someone who claimed not to know what he was looking for. He used the phrase sealed collection like he'd read it somewhere, not like he'd guessed it. "Duplicates," she repeated. "That's specific information for something you say you're not sure exists." His smile didn't move, but something behind it recalculated. A colleague mentioned it. "Professor Alan Reyes, University of Virginia. We're compiling a regional archive project." "I don't have a Reyes on file requesting access," Margaret said. "Nor any correspondence about a regional project. That would normally come through the county clerk's office, not walk in off the street." "Small towns," he said. "Paperwork lags." "Not this paperwork," Margaret said. "This paperwork doesn't lag. It doesn't exist yet for you." He left without pressing further, which told her more than anything he'd said. A genuine researcher, denied, would have argued, or asked who to call, or left a card. He simply nodded, the way a man does when he has learned what he came to learn, and walked out into the gray afternoon. Margaret watched from the window as he crossed the street, not to a car, but to a second man waiting near the corner, out of sight of the library's front glass but not out of sight of its side window, which she alone seemed to remember existed. She did not call the police. There was nothing yet to report. A man had asked about a fire, and left. But she went to the small back office, unlocked a drawer that had not been opened in over a year, and took out a battered leather notebook, its pages filled with names, dates, and a shorthand only she could read. She found the entry she wanted: Holloway Courthouse Fire, 1974, sealed, Federal Records Retention, Cross-Ref Holt, D. For Daniel. Her husband. Dead 9 years, and still, apparently, of interest to someone. She closed the notebook and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk, the way she used to sit before a briefing, decades ago, when stillness was a discipline rather than a habit. Then she stood, checked the back door was bolted, twice this time, not once, and returned to the front desk, where Ellie was helping a mother find picture books, entirely unaware that the quiet library around her had just tilted, very slightly, toward something old and unfinished. Margaret smiled at a passing patron, answered a question about renewing a library card, and gave no outward sign that anything at all had changed. But she had already begun, without announcing it even to herself, to remember things she had spent a long time trying to forget. They arrived on a Thursday, 3 of them, in a rented sedan that pulled into the library's small lot with the careful correctness of people trying not to be noticed by being noticed too little. Margaret watched them park from the returns window before they'd even opened the doors. The woman who came in first introduced herself as Dr. Louise Farron, historian, National Archive Consortium, a joint university federal research initiative. She had credentials, laminated, official-looking, a letter on university letterhead requesting collaborative access to regional archival materials pertaining to mid-century federal record-keeping practices in Holloway County. 2 men flanked her, introduced as research assistants, though one of them stood the way the man from 2 days earlier had stood, weight-balanced, eyes on the room before the shelves. "We understand you have a sealed collection," Dr. Farron said. "Donated decades ago. Never fully catalogued." "That's correct," Margaret said, folding her hands over the counter, unhurried. "It's sealed under a federal retention order. It isn't available for public or academic access without clearance from the originating agency." "We have that clearance," Farron said, and produced another document, official seal, signature, a case number that Margaret noted but did not react to. It was, she thought, a very good forgery. Not perfect. The seal was slightly too crisp, the kind of clean edge a real 40-year-old federal stamp never kept. "I'll need to verify this independently," Margaret said. "Through the agency directly. That's standard procedure, regardless of the paperwork in front of me." "Of course," Farron said, smiling the practiced smile of someone used to being trusted on site. "Though I should mention, we're on a tight schedule. Grant deadlines. We'd hoped to begin this afternoon." "Grants can wait for verification," Margaret said. "Federal seals don't get rushed. Not by me." There was a small pause, the kind that told Margaret the woman was recalculating, much like the man from 2 days before. Farron's smile held, but her eyes moved once toward the back hallway, toward the archive room door, visible past the reference stacks, a glance too quick to be idle curiosity, too specific to be anything else. "We'd be happy to wait," Farron said finally. "A day, if that's what it takes." "It might take longer," Margaret said. "These things often do." She offered them coffee, out of the same unhurried hospitality she offered every visitor, and watched them decline politely and take a seat near the reading tables instead. Not reading, she noted, but positioned. One faced the front door. One faced the hallway to the archive room. Farron faced Margaret. For the next 2 hours, they waited, made quiet conversation, thumbed through unrelated books for appearance. Margaret worked the desk as she always did, checking out books, answering the phone, helping a high schooler find material for a term paper, giving no outward sign that she had already begun composing, in her mind, the call she would make once the library closed. Not to the agency Farron claimed clearance from. To a number that had not changed in over a decade, though she had not dialed it in almost as long. At 4, the group left without pressing further, Farron thanking her with a warmth Margaret recognized as professional rather than sincere. "We'll be in town a few more days," Farron said at the door. "I hope we can resolve this quickly." "So do I," Margaret said, and meant it, though not in the way Farron would have assumed. She watched their sedan pull out of the lot and turn not toward the interstate, where a research team staying a few days might reasonably be headed to a hotel, but toward the old county road that led, eventually, nowhere but the abandoned rail depot and the house Margaret used to share with a man who had spent 30 years making sure certain things stayed buried. She locked the front doors early that evening, told Ellie to go home before dark, and sat alone in the library's fading light with her husband's old notebook open on the desk, reading names she hadn't said aloud in years. The collection was not history to these people. It was a debt someone had decided, after decades of silence, was finally due. First confrontation. They came back the next morning, earlier than the library opened, which was itself a message. Margaret was already inside, she always was, and saw them through the glass before they reached the door. Farron, the 2 assistants, and a 4th man Margaret hadn't seen before, older, gray at the temples, standing back from the others the way people stand when they are used to others doing the talking for them. She unlocked the door herself rather than make them wait, because waiting outside would only give them time to decide on a harder approach. "We verified the clearance ourselves overnight," Farron said. "No coffee small talk this time. Through channels we have access to. I understand you may not have received confirmation yet, but we're confident it will come through by end of day. Given the time sensitivity, we'd like to begin preliminary access this morning." "I haven't received anything," Margaret said. "And I won't grant access based on someone's confidence that a call is coming. That isn't how retention orders work. You know that, or you wouldn't have brought paperwork instead of just walking back there." The gray-templed man spoke for the first time. His voice was quieter than Farron's, and colder. "Mrs. Holt, we know your husband managed federal intake for this region for over 2 decades. We know he made decisions about what got sealed and what got destroyed. We're not here to embarrass his memory. We're here to correct an oversight in his record-keeping. That's all." Margaret let the sentence sit a moment before she answered, the way she'd been taught to let a threat finish speaking before responding to it. "My husband didn't make oversights," she said. "He made decisions. There's a difference, and the fact that you don't know it tells me you never actually met him." Something shifted in the man's face, not anger, but recalibration, the look of someone realizing the person across from them was not simply an obstacle but an informed one. "Then perhaps you can help us resolve this without further delay," he said. I can help you by telling you again that the collection is sealed under federal order, and that order does not lift because 4 people stand in my library insisting it should, Margaret said. If your clearance is real, it will come through the agency, in writing, verified through their office, not yours. Until then, nothing in this building moves. You understand, the man said, that we can pursue other means of gaining access. Legal, if necessary. You can pursue whatever means you like, Margaret said. I've spent 30 years watching people try official channels for things they had no official right to. It rarely goes the way they expect. For a moment, nobody spoke. Farron's practiced warmth had gone entirely, replaced by something flatter, more assessing. One of the assistants shifted his weight, the small motion of a man recalculating whether the woman in front of him was really just a librarian, and finding that the math no longer added up cleanly. We'll be back, the gray-templed man said finally, and it was not a threat delivered loudly, which was, Margaret knew, the more dangerous kind. I imagine you will, she said. They left without further argument, the sedan pulling away with the same deliberate unhurriedness it had arrived with. Margaret stood at the window until it turned the corner, then went to the phone behind the desk instead of her cell, and dialed a number from memory. Not the archive number, not the county line, but one she had not used since her husband's funeral. It rang twice before a voice she hadn't heard in 9 years answered. Holloway line, she said, giving the phrase her husband had taught her decades before, when procedure still meant something between them. Sealed collection compromised. Requesting status on retention order 74 Delta. There was a pause on the other end, the particular silence of someone recognizing a name they thought had gone quiet forever. Margaret, the voice said. It's been a long time. Not long enough, apparently, she said, and looked toward the hallway leading to the archive room, where a door that had not been opened in 3 decades now stood at the center of something she had hoped, for 9 years, was finally finished. So it had a clean angle on the hallway leading to the archive room, something it had never properly covered before. She replaced the batteries in the smoke detectors near the back office, not because they needed it, but because a working smoke detector was also, if wired correctly, a working sound sensor, and Margaret had wired hers correctly a long time ago, back when her husband first taught her that a library was not so different from any other building worth defending, it simply had different reasons to be defended. She checked the exterior doors one final time, testing the give in each hinge, each lock, feeling for anything that had been tampered with since the historian's visit. Nothing had. Not yet. That, she knew, only meant they were still deciding on their approach, not that they'd abandoned it. Near 10, she sat at the reference desk in the dark, the only light the small lamp she used for late paperwork, and allowed herself, briefly, to remember rather than simply prepare. Daniel had built the archive room's protections during a single week in 1991, telling the county commissioners it was for climate control, telling her the truth only after the work was done. Some things get sealed because they're finished, he'd said. And some things get sealed because they're not, because the moment isn't right yet to unseal them, and the only kindness left is patience. She hadn't fully understood him then. She suspected, now, 30 years later, she was beginning to. She thought of Ellie, in the next room over just hours before, complaining lightly about boredom, utterly unaware she worked beside a woman who had once been trained to notice a 5-minute delivery truck, a scuffed shoe, a seal too crisp to be 40 years old. Margaret felt no pride in that gap of understanding. Only a quiet, familiar loneliness, the particular isolation of protecting people by making sure they never had to know what they were being protected from. Before leaving, she did one more thing. From the bottom drawer of the reference desk, beneath a stack of outdated almanacs, she retrieved a small case she had not opened since her husband's funeral. Inside, not a weapon, though there had once been one issued to her, decades before, in a life she rarely spoke of even to herself, but a single item, small and unremarkable to anyone else, that she now clipped quietly to the inside of her cardigan pocket. Not because she expected to need it tomorrow, but because the historians had asked about the wrong file, mentioned the wrong number, and looked at the wrong door with the wrong kind of interest, and Margaret Holt had spent too many years learning what that combination usually meant to pretend, any longer, that this was simply an overzealous research team chasing a grand deadline. She turned off the lamp, locked the doors, and walked home under a sky that had gone fully dark, aware, in the old and practiced way she had once been trained to be aware, that she was, for the first time in 9 years, not entirely alone in being watched. The break-in happened at 2:14 in the morning, and Margaret knew it before the phone rang, because she had not, in fact, gone to sleep. She had been sitting in her kitchen since midnight, lights off, a mug of cold tea in front of her, watching the small monitor she'd connected to the repositioned camera. An old habit resurrected, a screen the size of her palm showing a grainy black and white feed of the library hallway. When the archive room door moved on the screen, swinging inward where it should have been locked, she was already reaching for her coat before her mind had finished confirming what her eyes had seen. She did not call the police. Whitfield's instruction held, and more than that, her own judgment held with it. Local officers walking into a federal retention breach without context would only get hurt, or worse, get in the way. She drove the 11 minutes to the library obeying every speed limit, because panic was a luxury she had trained out of herself decades ago, and arrived to find the front door forced to the frame, not shattered, just quietly pried, the work of someone who knew what they were doing and wanted time before anyone noticed. Inside, she moved without the flashlight she carried, using the building's own dark the way she once used the dark of places far less familiar than a small-town library. She heard him before she saw him, the assistant from Farron's team, the one who stood like he'd been trained rather than hired, crouched at the archive room's floor panel with a crowbar, 3 of the newspaper boxes already shoved aside. "Federal retention orders don't lift because you brought better tools than last time," Margaret said, from the doorway, her voice even, unhurried, the same tone she used to explain the Dewey Decimal System to schoolchildren. He turned fast, crowbar half-raised, and stopped, not because of the crowbar's uselessness against an unarmed 61-year-old woman, but because something in the way she stood, weight balanced, hands loose and ready rather than raised in surrender, told him this was not the confrontation he'd been prepared for. "You should go home," she said, "before this becomes something you can't walk back from." "You don't understand what's in that box," he said. "None of this is personal. We have a client. The client wants what's rightfully." "Nothing about a sealed federal file is rightfully anyone's," Margaret said. "Not yours. Not your client's. Whatever your client thinks they lost in 1974, the courts decided it 30 years ago, and reopening it now doesn't change the decision. It just adds a second crime to the first." He hesitated, and in the hesitation, Margaret saw exactly what she needed to see. Not a hardened operative, but a man hired for competence, not conviction, told a version of the truth simplified enough to justify the job. "Put the crowbar down," she said. "Leave the way you came in. I won't report the specifics of tonight if you leave now. I will report everything in detail if you don't." For a long moment, he didn't move, calculating. She could see it in his eyes. The same recalculation she'd watched happen twice already this week. The arithmetic of a man realizing the woman in front of him was not the obstacle her cardigan and reading glasses suggested. Then, slowly, he set the crowbar down on the floor and stepped back from the panel. "Farron's not going to let this go," he said, quieter now, something like a warning rather than a threat. "Whatever's in that box, she needs it more than she's telling any of us. Then Farron will have to explain to whoever she answers to why her plan failed twice," Margaret said. "Go home." He left through the forced door, into the dark, and Margaret stood alone in the archive room afterward, looking at the shoved boxes, the pried floor panel, the crowbar left behind like evidence of an intrusion she still could not fully report through any normal channel. She knelt, replaced the boxes, resealed the panel, and only then, for the first time since this had begun, allowed herself to open the steel case beneath it. Inside, beneath her husband's neat, government-trained handwriting, was a single sealed folder marked Holloway 74 Delta, Origin, Federal Reserve Regional Audit, Subject, Councilman T. Ashcroft, Embezzlement and Cover-Up, Courthouse Fire, Arson, Concealment of Evidence. Ashcroft. Margaret recognized the name, not from the file, but from the town itself. Ashcroft Memorial Park. Ashcroft Elementary. A name on half the plaques in Holloway, attached to a family that had spent 50 years being the town's proudest export. The call came the next afternoon, while Margaret was helping a retiree find large print westerns and Ellie was restocking the children's section near the front window. Margaret's cell phone, a number she gave to almost no one, buzzed once with a text from an unknown sender. "We have your assistant's schedule. She leaves at 6. Open the file, or she has a very bad walk home." Margaret read it twice, felt the old, familiar cold settle into her chest. Not panic, but the particular stillness that came before careful action, and looked across the room to where Ellie stood on a step stool, reaching for a picture book on the top shelf, laughing at something a small child had said, entirely unaware that her ordinary Tuesday had just become a bargaining chip. Margaret had spent 30 years being told, in one form or another, that the mission came first. She had believed it, mostly, because the mission she'd served on had rarely put a 23-year-old library assistant with headphones around her neck directly in the blast radius of someone else's greed. She did not call Whitfield. There wasn't time, and more than that, she suspected Whitfield's answer, protect the file, protect the order, let the agency handle the rest, would not adequately protect Ellie in the next 4 hours. Some decisions could not wait for proper channels. Margaret had learned that lesson exactly once before, a long time ago, in circumstances she did not allow herself to think about often, and she had promised herself then that she would not let procedure cost an innocent person again. She walked over to Ellie, spoke to her in the same even voice she used for everything, and told her to take the rest of the day off, a doctor's appointment excuse, a lie so small it barely registered as one, and watched her leave through the front door at 3:40, safely, 2 hours before the 6 o'clock deadline in the text. Then Margaret sat at the reference desk and composed her response. File stays sealed. But I'll give you something else. Meet me at the Depot Road turnout, 5 p.m. Alone. Anyone else shows up, this conversation ends. She was not naive about the risk. She was, in fact, entirely clear-eyed about it. Clearer, perhaps, than she had been about anything in the 9 years since her husband's funeral. She understood that walking alone to meet whoever was behind Farron's team meant accepting a danger she had spent nearly a decade telling herself she'd earned the right to leave behind. She went anyway, because Ellie's safety, and the town's ignorance of what its most respected family had once done, could not both be preserved by staying safely behind a library desk. At the turnout, the gray-templed man was waiting alone, as instructed, leaning against a car that Margaret recognized now as a rental, not a personal vehicle, a hired man, like the one from the archive room, working for someone who kept his own hands clean. I won't give you the file, Margaret said before he could speak. But I'll give you the truth in it, verbally, once, so you understand exactly what you're protecting, and exactly what happens if you don't stop. He said nothing, which she took as permission. Thomas Ashcroft embezzled county emergency funds in 1973, she said. When the state audit got close, he burned the courthouse to destroy the financial records. 2 firefighters were hurt containing it. My husband's agency investigated, built the file, and the case was quietly settled. Ashcroft's family paid restitution, and in exchange, the file was sealed rather than made public, to protect the town from the shame of what one of its most trusted families had done. That's it. That's the whole secret your client has spent decades and God knows how much money trying to erase. The man's face didn't move, but something in his posture did, the stillness of a man hearing, for the first time, the actual weight of what he'd been hired to retrieve. If your assistant is touched, Margaret continued, or if anyone connected to this library is threatened again, I will personally ensure this file becomes public, along with a federal report on tonight's attempted break-in, and your employer's name attached to both. I am not threatening you with paperwork. I am promising you a consequence. You understand, he said slowly, that we can't simply walk away. Our employer doesn't accept unfinished business. Then your employer can explain to federal investigators why an old county fire suddenly matters 50 years later, Margaret said. Tell him the woman at the library isn't afraid of him, and isn't someone he wants investigating why he's afraid of a sealed file in the first place. She turned and walked back toward her car before he could answer, her heart steady despite the cold running through her, aware that she had just spent a currency she rarely touched anymore. Direct exposure, direct risk, a version of herself she'd tried for 9 years to leave folded up in a drawer. She had protected Ellie. She had not protected herself, not fully, and driving home in the fading light, Margaret understood that the cost of tonight's choice was not yet finished being paid. They came that night, not with paperwork, not with charm, but with the blunt honesty of people who had run out of patience for anything else. Margaret heard the back door give at 11:50, not forced open loudly, but cut, cleanly, the sound of a tool meant for exactly this purpose. She was in the archive room already, had been for an hour, sitting in the dark beside the floor panel with a small case from her cardigan drawer resting on her knee, because some old instinct, sharpened over the last week into something closer to certainty, had told her the turnout conversation would not be the end of it. 3 of them entered. Farron, the gray-templed man, and one more she hadn't seen before, younger, moving with the flat efficiency of someone paid to finish things rather than negotiate them. They did not call out. They did not expect her to be awake, let alone waiting. You should have left this alone, Farron said, when the beam of her flashlight found Margaret sitting calmly against the far shelf. There was no pretense of historical research left in her voice now. We warned your employer. You threatened a library assistant, Margaret said, not moving. That wasn't a warning. That was a mistake. The younger man stepped forward first, the way young men often did, mistaking an old woman's stillness for fragility rather than what it actually was, patience. Margaret let him close half the distance before she moved, and when she did, it was economical, almost gentle to watch. A redirection of his own momentum, a controlled drop that put him on the floor without a strike thrown. His wrist held at an angle that made further movement genuinely unwise. I'd rather not break it, she said to him quietly. But I will, if you make me. He stayed down. Farron's flashlight had gone still, no longer searching the room but fixed entirely on Margaret, recalculating in the same way everyone in this story had eventually recalculated, only now with far less time to adjust to the new arithmetic. Who are you? Farron said. It was not really a question anymore. It was closer to a confession. I'm the librarian, Margaret said. That's not a cover story. That's simply not the whole story, and you were never entitled to the rest of it. The gray-templed man reached, slowly, for something at his hip. Not a weapon exactly, Margaret registered even in the dim light, but a phone, already recording, already a threat of a different kind. She let him raise it halfway before closing the distance between them herself, taking the device from his hand with a motion so unhurried it barely registered as force until it was already finished, and dropping it, screen down, onto the shelf beside her. You're not filming a scandal, she said. You're filming your own confession to attempted assault and breaking and entering into a federal facility. I'd think carefully before you finish that sentence you were about to say. He did not finish it. For a long moment, nobody moved. The younger man remained on the floor, wrist still held loosely by Margaret's hand, more from psychological leverage now than physical necessity. Farron stood frozen between fight and retreat, doing the same math everyone before her had done and arriving, finally, at the same answer. The Ashcroft family will simply hire someone else, Farron said, though the certainty in her voice had thinned considerably. Perhaps, Margaret said. But they'll be hiring against a federal case file that is, as of tonight, formally reopened. Attempted theft of protected records, coercion of a private citizen, assault. Whatever your employer thought he was protecting by digging this up, he's just guaranteed it gets far more attention than it would have if he'd simply let a 50-year-old fire stay a 50-year-old fire. She released the younger man's wrist and stepped back, giving them, deliberately, a path to the door. Go home, she said. All of you. Tell whoever is paying you that the file stays sealed, the town stays uninformed, and the matter ends here, tonight, or it becomes something none of you can control the shape of anymore. They left the way people leave when they finally understand they were never actually in charge of the situation they thought they were running. Quickly, without argument, without the practiced calm they'd arrived with days before. Margaret stood alone in the archive room afterward, breathing evenly, hand steady, the small case from her pocket still unopened, unused, exactly as she'd hoped it would remain. She had not raised her voice. She had not needed to. She resealed the floor panel, straightened the newspaper boxes, and turned off the single overhead bulb, leaving the room exactly as it had always looked to anyone who never had reason to look closely, ordinary, quiet, and entirely unremarkable. Whitfield called at 7 the next morning, before the library opened, his voice carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent the night making calls Margaret would never hear about. It's handled, he said. The Ashcroft family's attorney reached out to the agency directly at 3 a.m., offering full cooperation in exchange for the matter staying out of the press. Given the age of the original case and the family's current standing, the Bureau's willing to accept a quiet resolution, restitution, formal acknowledgement in the sealed file, no public disclosure unless someone forces the issue again. And the people who broke in? Margaret asked. Contractors. No loyalty once the money's stopped. They won't be back, and they won't talk. They've got more to lose than we do. A pause. You didn't have to handle it the way you did, Margaret. You could have called it in the moment the first man walked into your library. I could have, she agreed. But procedure doesn't move at 2 in the morning, and Ellie doesn't have federal protection. I had what I had. Whitfield didn't argue the point. He'd known her husband, and before that, he'd known her, back when the file itself had been current rather than sealed, and he understood, better than most, what it meant that she'd chosen restraint at every opportunity that hadn't directly endangered someone she was responsible for. There'll be a formal debrief, he said. Someone from the regional office, Sometime next week. Nothing that involves the town. We keep this quiet, same as always. Same as always, Margaret repeated, and there was no bitterness in it, only the particular tiredness of a woman who had spent most of her life being the reason quiet things stayed quiet. Ellie returned to work that afternoon, oblivious to how close she'd come to being leverage in a 50-year-old cover-up, chattering about a movie she'd seen the night before. Margaret listened, nodded in the right places, and said nothing about the archive room, the file, or the two men who had walked into her library expecting an old woman and found something else entirely. 2 federal agents came by on Thursday, polite, brief, dressed like insurance adjusters. They spoke with Margaret for 11 minutes in the back office, took a short statement, thanked her for her cooperation, and left without any of Holloway's regular patrons noticing they'd been there at all. Danny Wexler came in at 8:15 as always, and Margaret had his newspaper folded and waiting, same as every day. "You seem tired," he said, settling into his chair by the window. "Long week," she said. "Nothing serious." It was, in its way, both entirely true and nothing close to the truth, the exact kind of answer she had spent a lifetime learning to give, and the town, once again, accepted it without question, because that was what the town had always done, and what Margaret, for good reason, had always allowed it to do. Whenever it came, if it ever did. Danny Wexler arrived at 8:15, same as always, and Margaret had his paper folded and waiting. Ellie came in at 11, tote bag over one shoulder, complaining lightly that nothing interesting ever happened in Holloway, and Margaret let her believe it, because that belief was, in its own way, the thing she had spent the whole week protecting. At home that evening, Margaret opened the bottom drawer of her dresser, the one she rarely touched, and looked briefly at what lay inside: a folded flag, a single medal in a velvet case, a photograph of a much younger version of herself standing beside a man in uniform who had, decades later, become nothing more to the town of Holloway than a quiet name on an old library archive. No one had ever asked her about the photograph. No one ever would. She did not take it out to remember, exactly. She took it out, closed the drawer again, and returned to the kitchen to finish her tea, because remembering, for Margaret, had never required looking at proof. It required only the ordinary discipline of carrying something quietly, every day, without needing anyone else to know the weight of it. The next morning, the library opened at 8, though Margaret was there, as always, by 7. The town never learned what had happened in the archive room that week. The Ashcroft name stayed on its plaques, its elementary school, its memorial park, and Holloway continued believing, as it always had, that its history was exactly as tidy as its oldest families preferred it to be. Only Ellie, months later, watching Margaret calmly de-escalate a heated argument between 2 patrons over a returned book, a small moment, nothing dramatic, just a woman who somehow always knew exactly what to say and exactly when to say nothing, paused, for the first time, to wonder what else, in this quiet building, she had never quite seen the whole shape of. She never asked. Margaret never told her. And the library, as it always did, opened its doors the next morning at 8 o'clock, unremarkable, unchanged, and entirely unaware of how much stillness one woman could carry without ever once needing anyone to notice. End.